Hi there, and welcome back to Into the Word and the Big Picture of the Old Testament. Today we'll cover the books of Numbers and Deuteronomy. When I was 8 years old, the city I lived in built an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Soon after the pool opened, they also started a swim club. My brother and I joined that swim club, and so 2, 3, sometimes 4 times a week, we would walk to the swimming pool, which was only about a 5-minute walk away, and we'd go and practice. Now, perhaps my parents were a little stingy because they never bought us a sports bag. So my brother and I, we would just take our towel and our swim trunks, stuff them in a plastic bag, and walk to the swimming pool. Now, it happened quite a few times because I was so young. I was only about 8, 9 years old, that I would goof off either on the way going or on the way back, and I would take that plastic bag and swing it around, and I would throw it up in the air, and I would try to catch it. More than once, when I got home and I wanted to hang up my swim trunks and my towel to dry, I found out that I had actually lost my swim trunks. The first time this happened, my mom was really mad, and she sent me back to go find my swim trunks. Unfortunately, I didn't find them. Repeatedly, I would keep on doing this because really the issue was that I struggled with obedience. As we come to the book of Numbers, we see that it is the story of the Israelites traveling through the desert. But we also see that the Israelites struggled very much with obedience to God. The Hebrew name of the book is actually In the Desert. But when the Hebrew scriptures were translated into Greek, the title of the book was translated as Numbers. That is why in English and in many other languages, this book is called the Book of Numbers. The Book of Numbers includes the census reports that Moses and the Israelites recorded while they were living in the desert. But it also records the stories of what happened during their journeys through the desert. The book of Numbers can be divided into 3 sections. First, there are the instructions and preparations at Mount Sinai. Second, there is the failure of the Israelites to trust God in the desert. And third, there are the preparations to enter the Promised Land. What we see clearly in the book of Numbers is that the Israelites failed to trust God, and they failed to be satisfied with what God provided for them in the desert. They complained about the food, they complained about not having what they had in Egypt, and they even complained about the leadership of Moses. They actually went as far as to demand a new leader who would take them all the way back to Egypt, where they lived in slavery. The result was that God declared that none of the men who lived during that time would actually enter the Promised Land. There are several lessons that we can learn from the book of Numbers. First of all, we can learn that there are always consequences to being disobedient. Secondly, we can also learn that even leaders can at times be disobedient. Thirdly, we have to understand that rebellion against God's appointed leader is really rebellion against God. I'm talking here about an attitude of the heart. It doesn't mean that we cannot question leaders. It doesn't mean that we can't talk with them or that we can't ask questions to understand what they're doing. But I'm really talking about an attitude of the heart that says, I have refused to follow you even though you are the leader that God appointed. And another lesson that we can learn from the book of Numbers is that obedience and faith go hand in hand. We show our faith in God and what He wants us to do by our obedience. We show our lack of faith by our disobedience. That brings us to the book of Deuteronomy. I just mentioned that there were Israelites who complained and grumbled against God. And God had decided that these people would not enter into the Promised Land. That meant that only a younger generation of Israelites would enter the Promised Land. But these people were too young to remember the establishment of the covenant at Mount Sinai. The book of Deuteronomy therefore focuses on the re-establishment of the covenant between God and these younger Israelites. Now, instead of focusing on the details of the covenant ceremony, the book of Deuteronomy focuses on the re-establishment of the covenant through the farewell addresses of Moses. Deuteronomy contains 3 long speeches of Moses. The goal of these speeches is to tell the Israelites that they have to be faithful to God. So the focus of the book of Deuteronomy is for the Israelites to remember what God did from the time of Mount Sinai. It also focuses on going over the covenant law or the 10 Commandments. Deuteronomy repeats what the covenant actually means. and towards the end it installs Joshua as the new leader of Israel. Something that we haven't touched on yet is that the covenant that God established with the Israelites followed the pattern of political covenants between different people groups. When one people group conquered another people group, the conqueror would usually establish a covenant with those people. Another word for a covenant is actually a treaty. This covenant or this treaty was always initiated by the person or by the people group who had conquered the other group. Both the overlord or the conqueror and the people who were conquered had obligations according to this covenant or according to this treaty. On the one side, the overlord promised protection for the people he had just conquered. On the other side, the people who he had just conquered promised obedience, and they also had to pay a tribute or a tax on an annual basis. These covenants were usually established by sacrificing an animal and cutting it up into pieces, and then the representatives of both people groups would walk among those pieces. That may sound really strange to us, but this is the way it was actually done back in those days. The covenant that God established with the Israelites followed the same pattern. It was established by God, it was initiated by God, not by the Israelites. And in this covenant, both God and the Israelites had certain obligations. God promised that if the Israelites were to follow these obligations, He would protect them and He would provide for them. On the other side, the Israelites were to worship God and be obedient to the regulations and rules that He gave them. The covenant clearly stipulates that if the Israelites would turn back from God and they would start worshiping other gods and they would start to be disobedient to God, then God would withdraw His blessing, He would withdraw His protection, and He would withdraw His provision. Later on in the history of Israel, we see actually that this is really what happened. This is actually something that's really important and that we will come back to when we talk about the prophets. It may look as this has nothing to do with how we live our lives as Christians in the 21st century. All of this is really far removed from us in culture. But there are some things that we can learn from the book of Deuteronomy. At times, it is good to take some pause and to look back at what God has done in our lives, to see where we have come from, where we are at today, and where we are supposed to go. We may also have our personal stories of the things that God has done for us in our lives. How God maybe has provided for us through a job or through some miraculous way, or how God has healed us, or touched us, or protected us from something. Now, as we come to the end of the Pentateuch, let's have a quick overview of the first 5 books of the Bible. Genesis covers the beginning of the world, the beginning of humanity, the beginning of the Jewish people, and the beginning of the Jewish faith. Exodus is then about the establishment of the Jewish nation. The book of Leviticus gave the Israelites instructions on holy living and worship. Numbers showed how the Israelites failed to trust God in the desert, and the book of Deuteronomy is about restoring the covenant. In the next session, we will continue with the historical books. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.